The most solemn, serious, and consequential act that the United States can undertake at any moment is to make the decision to send Americans into war. From time to time, war may be an unfortunate decision, but a necessary decision. A necessary and potentially tragic function of any republic. And it might be necessitated by the need to safeguard the rights and the freedoms of the government's own citizens from foreign states, from those who would harm us. Yet, we should enter into those wars and enter into any alliances that could lead to war only after utmost deliberation and strategic consideration, focusing specifically on the well-being of the American citizens. Those people who we're sworn to protect, those people whose safety is at stake whenever we go to war. That's why for the past several months, I've asked that the Senate have a roll call vote on the measure to ratify Montenegro's accession to the North Atlantic Treaty. And that's why I'll be casting my vote against expanding NATO later today. Of course, treaties and alliances with other countries can be beneficial. There's no question about that. But the founders of this country understood that their seriousness needs also to be considered. That the seriousness of a treaty needs to be taken into account in the same way that you have to consider very carefully the seriousness of going to war, and for the very same reasons. That's why both of these powers, the power to make and ratify treaties and the power to declare and execute war, are given not to one single branch of the federal government, but rather they're shared by the legislative and executive branches acting together. In addition to this, treaty ratification requires not just a majority vote, but a two-thirds supermajority vote within the Senate. The United States should enter into treaties and alliances with foreign nations that will enhance the ability of American citizens to exercise their rights and freedoms and to safeguard those same people. At the heart of the NATO alliance is the Article 5 guarantee for collective defense, stating in essence that an attack against any one NATO ally will be perceived and responded to as an attack against all. This means that the United States is obligated by treaty to make war because of an attack on an ally, and those allies are obligated to us for the same purpose, to the same extent. This, of course, is a very significant agreement. It's one that we should never take lightly. It's never one that we should just assume into existence anytime we have a decision to make. Simply put, I don't see how the accession of Montenegro, a country with a population smaller than most congressional districts, and a military smaller than the police force of the District of Columbia, is beneficial enough that we should share an agreement for collective defense. Montenegro becoming a member of NATO is certainly attractive to European countries because it makes the United States the security guarantor of yet another country in a region prone to instability and ethnic unrest. But that doesn't automatically make it of interest to the American people. It doesn't automatically mean that the benefits outweigh any risks to the American people by bringing this country into NATO. On the other hand, I believe that the risks could outweigh the benefits to the detriment of the American people and result in more of our service members being deployed overseas and at risk. The resolution of ratification on which the Senate is voting states that, quote, an attack against Montenegro or its destabilization arising from external subversion would threaten the security of Europe and jeopardize United States national security interests, close quote. This makes NATO responsible not only for external security, but combating destabilization in a historically volatile part of the world. Undertaking obligations like these only increases the likelihood of Americans being placed in harm's way, of our brave young servicemen and women having to go into a potential field of battle. Further, expanding NATO does not address some of the systemic problems that U.S. administrations from both sides of the aisle have long pressed to their European counterparts. The failure of many NATO countries to meet decades-old defense spending obligations and the increasingly concerning behavior of some NATO members. For example, several weeks ago, it was announced that American military personnel are now being used in northern Syria for the purpose of preventing infighting between one of our NATO allies, Turkey, and our Kurdish allies in the coalition against ISIS. This was followed in short order by a diplomatic crisis between Turkey and the Netherlands, both NATO allies, in which the Turkish president accused the Dutch government of fascism. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker in February rejected calls from the Trump administration, which were similar to pleas from the Obama administration for European countries to increase their own defense spending in fulfillment of their existing obligations through NATO. Addressing such issues is much more vital to the future of NATO and American interests in Europe than further rounds of expansion. Finally, some of my colleagues have argued that we should move forward with Montenegro's accession into NATO because the Russians oppose it, just as the Russians have opposed all previous rounds of expansion. This is not the basis for a sound foreign policy. While the United States should not let another country have a veto over our national security decisions, it would be equally unwise for the United States simply to engage in certain actions just because geopolitical adversaries might oppose them. Such reactionary statecraft contradicts the ideals of prudence and practicality that our founders hoped would guide our foreign policy. And on a more practical level, it still doesn't mean that we should just be willing to put our armed forces in a position where our brave young men and women might have to go into harm's way as a result of the fact that a geopolitical adversary takes the opposite viewpoint. Further, elected officials should not have their patriotism or loyalty to country questioned because of their understandable concerns about national security, about treaty obligations, and about war. There are many thoughtful leaders and policy experts who have legitimate concerns both about Russia's behavior and about the direction of NATO, and who support meaningful pressure against Russia through economic and diplomatic means, as well as the modernization of our strategic deterrent and missile defense systems. This vote, of course, is likely to pass, and Montenegro will become the newest member of NATO this year. It's my sincere hope that the country will be a constructive force in addressing the operational and mission problems that I've described, and that the Trump administration will press for needed reforms. But I also hope that American diplomatic leaders and Congress will work to identify and act on the security interests most relevant to the American people, and think more strategically about our alliances and treaty partners in the future. Thank you, Mr. President.